Докладчик. Тут речь будет вот о чем. Когда мы внедряем новые технологии в нашей компании, когда мы начинаем работать по гибким технологиям, у нас есть один процесс, который нам может очень сильно мешать, это риск-менеджмент. Там вам все равно вначале будут заставлять писать большие-большие таблицы рисков и все заранее выяснять. Каким образом жить с этим и каким образом это избегать, будет рассказывать Дональд будет рассказывать. Вот, поприветствуйте.
Thank you. So I'm going to say something here. Добрый день. Мне очень нравится быть здесь, в Москве. Когда я был молодым человеком, мой друг сказал, что интеллигентный человек должен говорить по-русски. 40 лет назад я изучал русский язык в университете. Очень грустно, что я все забыл, потому я буду говорить по-английски. So, in case that wasn't translated into English, I was saying that it's not an accident that I speak Russian. I actually studied Russian in school, but it was a very long time ago. We'll talk in English. Okay, I want to talk about this problem of robustness and the way we think about uncertainty in product development processes. And the primary mentality that we see, and the one we get from manufacturing, is the idea that variability is bad. Because in manufacturing, we will almost always make money if we reduce the variability within the process. And to me, that's an extremely dangerous idea to take that idea and move it into product development. And I want to explain some of the technical reasons behind why I feel that way. Now, the typical strategy of people who deal with variability when they believe variability is bad, one thing they do is they try to protect themselves from the variability by choosing to do things that are lower variability. So that's one strategy. They reduce the risk they're taking, and you could see where that would affect innovation. The second thing that you'll see people doing, like with theory of constraints, is they commit to things that are more variable, but they insert buffers between their commitment and the likely outcome. And so they undercommit on performance, they undercommit on schedule, they undercommit on budget. And those choices have economic consequences. So let's take a look at the first strategy. The first strategy is, well, I'm not going to do things that are risky. So this would be like if you told your child in school, I want you to get good grades, and the child said, oh, I have a strategy for getting good grades. I'm only going to take easy courses. And that will, in fact, achieve the objective of not getting bad grades, but it might not give you an education if you do that. So you have to be clear what the purpose is. And the same is true when you're competing in a commercial environment, is that if you only choose to do easy things and your competitors choose to do more difficult things, you're not going to gain a commercial advantage. Now, the other strategy is actually more dangerous because people can recognize when they're doing very easy things. The other strategy is people say, I'm going to do something that has a large variability in it, but instead of committing to the most likely outcome, what I'll do is I'll commit to a very conservative outcome. So I will end up committing to, I'll make this tail small, not because I'm doing something easy, but because I'm inserting a buffer in the process. And that, if you think about that, and I'll show you this in a diagram in a second, is what you're doing is you need to think about what currency am I spending to buy a reduction in variability? And the currency here, by undercommitting on schedule, is you're spending the currency of cycle time to reduce a variability in cycle time. Well, if you do any sort of economic analysis and you ask the question, how valuable is cycle time in most technical businesses, spending the currency of cycle time as a way of making conformance look good is a very expensive way to deal with the problem. So I'll just show you this. This is the land of Kolmogorov, so you understand probability and statistics, right? It's an easy way to show it. So here what I'm doing is I'm graphing cumulative probability of completion versus the time on the x-axis. And there's a very low probability I will complete at this time. There's a 50% chance I will be complete by this time. There's a 100% chance I will complete by that time. It's a good way of depicting time outcomes, statistically. Now, if I commit at the 50% point, this pink shaded area is really telling me what the expected delay is, because each little horizontal slice on this is a probability and an amount of delay. So when I integrate this area, that is telling me the expected delay I will see on the program. And this yellow area, which most people don't pay attention to, they only pay attention to what the expected delay is. But this yellow area is what I am giving away by setting the commitment at the 50% point. The earlier outcomes, if the organization is ready to launch the product at the 50% confidence point, you're not going to be launching earlier than that. Now, what happens when we get conservative and we start shifting up to the 90% point? So I move up here and I have a 90% confidence that the project will be complete by that time. And I have a very small tail there of what is the likely delay on the process. But what I'm really losing is this red shaded area. I'm losing all of the opportunity to end up delivering earlier than that commitment point, particularly when you're coordinating multiple departments in an organization to all align around the 90% point. And the problem is, if you are competing against other companies who are committing at the 50% point and you're building in the extra margin in your schedule so you can look like you have very good conformance with your schedule, you're often going to be later than the other companies in introducing the innovations. Okay, so this is the problem of avoiding the variability. Now, when people conclude that variability is bad, their antidote is often robustness, sort of the strength of the system. So one approach to robustness is what I would call passive robustness. And there what you do is, and in fact, this is my first trip to Russia, so I've never seen a Russian tractor. But one of the examples we always give in America for robust design is the way Russians design tractors, because we've always heard stories that the tractors are designed with very high design margins and they last for 40 years. There's lots of margin in a Russian tractor. But that is the classic idea of robustness. You increase the margin, you will tend to increase the inertia in the systems, and the system will not respond to a perturbation, a disruptive force, but there is actually a cost with making variability go away by using robustness as the tool. And I can explain it pretty easily. If you look at something like a sailboat, what passive robustness would be in the operation of a sailboat. So this is an America's Cup yacht by New Zealand, who ended up, little tiny nation that ended up beating the United States in the America's Cup back in 1995. Very smart people, but they didn't have as much money. Well, if the winds that you deal with when you're sailing are variable, and you cannot make that variability go away. The only way you can make the variability go away is you don't sail. You know, you end up leaving your boat in the port. But if you're going to sail, you're going to deal with variable winds. One way to passively cope with that variability is to say, I'm going to reduce the amount, because the winds can capsize you, they can tip the boat over. So you say, and if you capsize, you lose the race, so you don't want to capsize. And one strategy is I expose less sail. I use smaller sails in order to, and that will prevent you from capsizing. The smaller you make the sail, the less force will be capsizing your boat. The problem is small sails make you go slower, and you don't win races when you end up going slower. So in fact, what you do is you use an active, a form of active robustness, which is the people on the boat shift over, the term in English is called hiking out, but the people go to the opposite side from the side that the boat is tilting to in order to compensate for the moment that is being caused by the wind. And then they move back. And the difference between the active robustness and the passive robustness is for passive robustness, you're paying the cost of that robustness 100% of the time. For active robustness, you're only incurring the cost at the time you need it. You're not sort of paying the cost all the time. So active robustness is generally the thing that is most interest to us. What we use is we use active feedback loops to compensate for the variability in the external environment. And it'll achieve stability, but the problem is, although you get the stability, you can often mask the deterioration in the system. That you can actually be losing margin in your system and you won't see it because the feedback loop ends up hiding it from you. And I want to give you, and that can lead to overconfidence. And I want to give you just sort of an example, sort of a biological example of these feedback loops because it's easy to remember. Okay, so the term in English for the body's tendency to maintain a constant state is called homeostasis. You maintain the same state. And if you have a major trauma, like a major injury that causes you to bleed a lot, your body will try to, even though you're losing blood, your body will try to keep you alive. And in particular, it is trying to maintain blood flow to the brain because when you don't get blood flow to the brain, you do stupid things, and being stupid hurts your chance of survival. And so you want to have blood flow to the brain. Now, in shock, this is the state of this is called shock, the term we use in English. It might be the same term in Russian, I don't know. But there are two stages of shock. One is known as compensating shock, which is when the feedback loops are working effectively. And the other one is decompensating shock, which is when the feedback loops lose the ability to keep the person alive. So during compensating shock, the type of shock we're talking about, there are multiple types of shock in medicine, but what we're talking about, it's known as hypovolemic shock, is you have a low level of volume in your bloodstream. It's called hypovolemic. So what happens is you get the injury, you're losing the blood, but the interesting thing is you're going to see the blood pressure is staying normal. Is your key performance indicator, which is blood pressure, and blood pressure is determining the flow of blood to the brain and things, that's looking good. And alertness, which is one of the other things we monitor on somebody who has been injured, is that, can they respond to questions and things? That will be preserved as well. But it doesn't mean that the system is not deteriorating. What is actually happening is the heart stroke volume, the quantity of blood you pump at a moment in time gets larger. You get what is called vascular or vasoconstriction. Your body stops sending blood to portions of the body that don't need it. It says, we don't need blood in the digestive system, we need blood in the brain. So it starts shutting down a lot of the peripheral circulation. it increases the heart rate, it increases the respiration rate, and that's what ends up preserving your consciousness and alertness when you initially go into shock. So what is actually happening is there are indicators that are changing, but the indicators are not the ones you normally monitor. They're not key performance indicators. And what will happen in uncompensated shock is you are no longer able to maintain the blood flow to the brain, and then the heart rate drops, the breathing slows, you stop providing oxygenated blood to the brain and things, you start losing the ability to produce the oxygenated blood. And in decompensating shock, that's the dangerous stage of shock because very often you end up being dead. As you transition into decompensation, you don't have very much time left that you will remain alive unless people can do something to give you extra blood. And so what is happening there in decompensating shock is you see this, the heart rate keeps going up, but blood pressure is dropping, alertness is dropping, and then eventually you reach the point where the low blood pressure, the heart starts slowing down, and then you're going to be dead. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is true in engineering systems, in product development processes, as well as in the human body, is that you actually always have indicators that the system is losing margin. You just have to pay attention to the right indicators. And those correct indicators are actually not the key performance indicators that you traditionally think of as being important. So you might think of things like meeting the schedule and meeting the product requirements and meeting the budget as being extremely important. And you say, these are the things we need to monitor in our program. But let's say the team is very reliably meeting their schedule week after week after week. But what is happening is initially the team is working 8 hours a day, and then they're working 10 hours a day, and then they're working 12 hours a day, and then they're working 16 hours a day, is that you are losing margin in that system. You are approaching the point where that will fail catastrophically on you. But if you're only measuring are the deliverables done on time, you will miss the fact that the system is losing its margin. Okay? So it's very important when we monitor our systems, particularly if we have chosen, this is not a problem with passive robustness. Passive robustness doesn't produce these problems, but active robustness is an extremely good technique to control things in the presence of uncertainty, but you really need to pay attention to the health of the feedback loops and how much margin you actually have in the feedback loop when you're using that strategy. Now, what I want to look at now is another way of looking at this problem. So the legacy we have from a lot of engineering and certainly all of manufacturing is that variability is always evil. Now, if you went to an economist and you said, you know, in manufacturing we have learned that you maximize economic outcomes if you minimize variability, and that this is always true, the economist would tell you, oh, you understand nothing about economics. You obviously understand nothing about economics or finance or business if you think minimizing variability maximizes economic outcomes. Now, why would they say that? Back in the 1990s, there were two Americans that won the Nobel Prize in economics for the Black-Scholes option pricing model. It was Robert Merton and Myron Scholes did it. Black had died, and you don't get a Nobel Prize if you're dead when they're awarding the prize. But it was the first time anybody had precisely quantified the value of an option, the financial value in the option. And I want to sort of explain what the logic was of what they were doing and then relate it to product development. So the idea on a stock option is that you have a strike price. That is the price at which you are allowed to buy the security, the stock that you have an option on. So let's say you have an option to buy Apple stock for $110 a share. If on the day the option expires, the price is below $100 a share, below 110, let's say it's down at $90, you will not exercise the option. You're not going to buy the stock for $110 if it's available on the market for $90. So you lose the value of the option. But it doesn't matter how far below $110 it is you will always lose exactly the same amount of money. And this is what we call the payoff function. Now, if the stock is above $110, for every dollar it is above, then you make an extra dollar. And we call this an asymmetric payoff function because the upside is higher than the downside on it. Now, the future price of the stock is actually unpredictable. It's a log normal distribution, looks a lot like a normal distribution. Or it's the best fit is log normal. It's not actually precisely log normal. It has fatter tails. But the interesting thing about it is that when you multiply this, the way we get mathematically, the way we compute an expectation is we multiply a probability function by another function. So for an economic expectation, we multiply the probability function by the payoff function. I multiply these functions together, I get something like this. This graph of expected payoff is telling us what portion of the option's value is coming from different price points that might occur in the future. Now, the reason an option has value is the area on the right side above the x-axis is larger than the area on the left side. That's what creates the economic value. And the point I want to make is that difference in area is not coming from an asymmetry in the probability function. The probability function is essentially symmetrical. It is the payoff function which is really altering, making options have value. And I then pose a question to you is that if I were to increase the variability of the stock price, in finance, the term in English we use is volatility. That's what you'll see in the world of finance. It means the same thing as variability. If I increase the variability in the stock price, would an option be worth more money or less money? Absolutely. The children of Kolmogorov got it right? No, absolutely, because you spread the tails on both sides. When you spread the tail on the left side, it has no cost at all. When you spread the tail on the right side, it extends into the high payoff region, and the option ends up having more value. So here I've done the calculation with two different levels of variability. The blue is the low variability, the red is the high. And what you see is the area on the left side is actually the same. It's just distributed differently. But on the right side, the tail spreads out into the high payoff region and things. So if you went to an economist and you said minimizing variability maximizes economic outcomes, the economist would say, yes, I can think of situations in which that is true, and I will show you a little later how in manufacturing that actually is true. But it is very dangerous to end up saying that that is always true. And in fact, what that, this is just how we compute an expectation. We just multiply probability function by payoff function. But the important thing is traditionally, we've been focusing all of our attention on probability functions. We've had these Six Sigma programs to try to drive down the variability with that's the way we're going to improve the economics. Now, I believe there is actually much more money to be made by focusing on the payoff functions. And that is, it's very consistent with what you heard Dave saying about what you need to do is safe experiments, and then when you learn from the experiments, you use that. It's consistent with what Dave Snowden was saying and with Dave Anderson talking about the feedback loops. I think the money to be made is in working on payoff functions. It's interesting because they are actually the result of management choices, is that when you end up making different management choices, you can alter it. And our traditional strategies of saying avoiding uncertainty or buffering uncertainty, I can sort of show you that on the same diagram. The avoiding uncertainty strategy is really moving from the red curve to the blue curve. And the buffering is really ending up saying that I'm going to undercommit and I'm going to give up some of those very high payoff outcomes in the process. And I think those are actually poor economic choices when you end up undercommitting in markets where there is a high cost of delay associated with your products. Okay, so now I want to look at the problem in a slightly different way, is the systems that are fragile, you can sort of explain them as being that when you have a perturbation, an impulse hitting the system, then their performance decreases. And a system that is robust is one where you can hit it with an impact, but it won't change its performance very much at all. Now, there's an interesting author. His name is Nassim Taleb. He has written some very good books. I think they must be translated into Russian because you folks like statistics. So Fooled by Randomness was sort of the first one. The Black Swan was a very popular one. But he's got a new book, Anti-Fragile, and he has an interesting view in it. And he says most people think that robustness is the opposite of fragility. But he said what we really need to think of is what is the opposite of fragility is not systems that don't change in the present, but systems that end up achieving better performance when they end up getting hit by an impact on the system. And that is actually all about feedback loops. Now, he talks about it in terms of convex payoff functions and things, but for us as product developers, the interesting thing about it is feedback is what allows us to produce that sort of asymmetric response, the anti-fragile systems that we end up having. Now, let me give you just a little example of feedback and why we do it and how it makes money in product development. And this is just a little toy problem, but it's simple enough that it illustrates the point very well. So I'm going to let you pick a 3-digit number, and I'm going to charge you $3 to play the game. And if you pick the correct 3-digit number, you will receive $3,000. Well, you're all numerate enough to realize that one chance out of 1,000 of making $3,000 is worth $3. That first game is a break-even game. Now, what if I offered to play the game another way, where I say, first you pick the first digit, and then I'll charge you $1 for the first digit, $1 for the second digit, and $1 for the third digit. It's still $3 to buy 3 digits. But I will give you feedback after the first digit whether you picked the correct first digit, and then you could decide whether you wanted to pick the second digit. And I'll give you feedback after the second digit, and then you can decide whether you want to pick the third digit. That is a huge change in the game, right? And so what I've depicted here is what is the probability that you will buy the first digit, the second digit, or the third digit. There's a 100% chance you will buy the first digit, there is a 10% chance you will buy the second digit, and there is a 1% chance you will buy the third digit. So what that really means is the average payoff of the second game is $1.89. It's not zero payoff, it's $1.89 on average every time you play the game. Now, the interesting question is, why has that payoff changed? And what I haven't changed the size of the prize, it's still $3,000. I haven't changed the chance that you will pick the correct 3-digit number, it's still 1 out of 1,000. I haven't changed the cost of buying 3-digit, it's still $3. Is what I've done, and there are a couple of people sort of writing about applying real options in product development. There's a Dutch guy, Olaf Maassen, and there's Chris Matz from England. And in their vocabulary and in a financial vocabulary, what we would say is the difference in the second game is that there are embedded options. you have the option to shut down the game after buying the first digit. You have the option to shut down the game after buying the second digit. And it is the value of those embedded options that is actually causing the game to be worth more money. And it's worth pointing out, where are we getting the embedded options from is that it's because we are buying information in small batch sizes. We are not buying 3 digits worth of information in one large batch. We're buying the first digit, and then the second digit, and then the third digit. So the interesting thing in product development is when we start looking at the payoff functions, let's say we want to create a world in which variability produces higher economic outcomes. From a practical perspective, what that means is we want to be able to put more muscle behind the paths that are producing good outcomes after we find out that they're producing good outcomes, or that it is getting more probable that the outcome would be good. Because we don't need deterministic information. All we need to know that the probability of a path is going to be high, success is going to be higher. And what we want to do is to actually shut down the unproductive outcomes earlier in the process. And again, your ability to be able to amplify good responses, your ability to be able to dampen bad responses comes from using smaller batches in the process, because you get the information, the exploitable information earlier when you're using small batches in the process. So my view of the world is that we get anti-fragility by truncating, by terminating bad outcomes early, by amplifying good outcomes. These are not even just outcomes that we can predict. These are outcomes that we can't predict. We want to quickly recognize when facts are changing and respond to it. It's very consistent with, although less sophisticated than the ideas you heard from Dave Snowden. And again, I would say payoff asymmetries in product development are not an accident of nature. They are the result of management choices. Now, who else does this? Where do you see models of this in the world and things? This idea of minimizing downside by bypassing obstacles and exploiting opportunities and things like that. See, there would be some Russian somewhere in the presentation, right? So, например, специального назначения. I think that's sort of like Spetsnaz, right? But yeah, all of the elite military forces tend to work that way. They say we can't predict what is going to end up happening, is that what we want to do is see what the facts are on the ground and respond to the new information we get. And as a result, they want to have very fast feedback loops. They want to grant a lot of authority down to low levels in the organization. And that is actually the same formula we use in product development. If we want to get fast responses, we have to push authority down low in the organization to be able to do that. The view of the military is uncertainty does not favor one side over the other. It favors the side that can function in the presence of uncertainty. And I mean, I often, how do we do this again in product development? When you use small batch sizes, reducing batch sizes in product development turns out to be extremely important. I won't discuss how you do it, but you've probably read enough to know that you reduce batch size by reducing transaction cost. Low transaction cost enables small batch sizes. How are you able to do daily testing in software? You do it because you've automated the test process to lower the transaction cost there. But I would say what many people do in product development is they treat product development as a race where you end up saying that I have to decide which horse is going to be the fastest horse in the race, and I have to bet my money before the race starts. And I would say a more correct way to do product development is to say it is a race where you can change your bet after the horses have started running. And As the race continues, it becomes clearer that some horses are going to lose and some horses are more likely to win. The conditional probability of success is constantly changing as time progresses. And what you want to have a capacity to do in a process is to take money away from the horses that are falling behind and to move the money to the horses that look like they're going to win the race, even if you didn't think they looked like a winner at the beginning when you first started. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this is none of this kind of thinking shows up in lean manufacturing, in the manufacturing world. It actually shows up very much in the lean startup world. The idea of saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a hypothesis that I test, and if I get a good outcome, I'll continue to persist, and if I get a bad outcome, I will pivot and adjust my course. So bet on the horses as close to the end of the race as you can get. And now, why did the manufacturing people have a different view of the world? The payoff function that you have in manufacturing is something called the Taguchi loss function. And what it refers to is whenever I deviate from my target, either being above or below, I end up incurring a loss. Either my design has too much quality in it or it has too little quality in it. And if I told you the payoff function looked like this, what amount of variability would you want to have? What would be the ideal amount of variability to have? 0 variability. So the manufacturing conclusion is absolutely correct for that domain, but the problem is the domain of product development usually has huge payoff asymmetries, and the ideas we get from manufacturing about variability are wrong most of the time in product development. They're right as the product is entering the factory, but they're wrong for the beginning of the process. Okay, so here are just sort of a few takeaways before lunch. Don't fear variability. I don't think variability, and don't celebrate variability. It's only variability in the presence of asymmetric payoffs that ends up making you money. It's not, variability is not either good or evil. It depends on the system that you're putting the variability through. Be really careful with buffers. I've seen a lot of people making mistakes by inserting time buffers, which really throws away a lot of money. Monitor your safety margins because there are leading indicators that will tell you your system is losing active robustness. Focus on the payoff functions, not the probabilities. Accelerate the feedback loops. Is that, now you could bring it to the point of going too extreme here. Sometimes if your batch size is too small and your feedback loop is too fast, you will respond to noise instead of signal. But in fact, accelerating feedback loops is probably the correct thing to do for 99% of product developers. Buy information in small batches. In product development, small batches are sort of the single most important thing I think we can do to end up improving performance in product development. And buying information in small batches gives you the chance to exploit it. And it's even more important when you have high variability. Think like a smart gambler. Create options to bypass obstacles and exploit opportunities. Shut down your unproductive paths early. And then I always tell people is that you can get really distracted by this idea of conformance, that I need to conform to the original plan that I set out for. And I would say that what we want to do in product development is we want to train people and enable people to make good economic choices. So you may start a development process believing a feature is important to 50% of the customers, believing it will take you 1 week of work to do it. You may get into your development process, discover the feature is important to 5% of the customers instead of 50%, and that it's going to take 10 weeks instead of 1 week. That is a factor of 100 difference in the benefit to cost ratio between when you started and when you're partway through the process. I've never seen a feature that will survive a factor of 100 difference in the cost of the benefit to cost ratio. So you need to have a mechanism to bring that question back on the table and to evaluate whether it still makes sense. Because when the facts change, you need to change what you're doing. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover, and some of you are already familiar with these books. I saw a copy of the middle one, and somebody had an electronic copy of the other one. Those little blue squares and black triangles, I don't know if they use those down in Sochi, but in the US that means easy, easy, hard. If you think it's hard to read in English, it's hard to read for people who are native speakers of English because it's a pretty dense book. So, but it's broken into little tiny batches and you should be able to read it. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover. Jest вопросы? Or you should say есть вопросы. Yeah.
Продолжать. Там я всегда почему-то пропускаю. Есть вопросы в том конце зала? Нет?
По-английски.
Но можно по-русски, я переведу потом.
По-русски? Okay.
Окей.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Тогда давайте еще раз Дональда поблагодарим. Во-первых, за прекрасный рассказ, а во-вторых, за то, что он нас выровнял с обедом.
Okay.
Thank you very
All right.
much.
Enjoy.